Have you guys have an experience that you're just into the zone? Like when you're doing something, there was no distractions and nothing around you. You're just focusing on the tasks. That is a flow state. What would happen to our cognitive abilities when we avoid problems in our lives? How we can be emotional and reasonable at the same time. 你好, hi everyone, I'm Celine. Welcome back to my channel. So this video, I'll be sharing the second part of the interview I did with John Vervaeke. We talked about a lot of interesting topics such as flow state, wisdom, the relationship between reason and emotions. So if you want to learn more about these topics, please join us in today's video. What's your definition of transformation and what's the science behind it? Does transformation really happen? How does people experience that?
Yeah, it does, and people experience it on a continuum, I would argue. In fact, I'm working with Daniel Gregg to a book called The Cognitive Continuum. So let's think about it this way. You admitted, I don't mean like grudgingly, you happily admitted of a kind of very small scale transformation, insight. You have the aha moment. You were fixated on it this way, and then you went, oh no, and then you go, and you see it this way. And you, from that new perspective, insight, you can see into things that you couldn't see before, and you can see the inadequacies of your previous perspective. So it's an insight. What happens if I put you in a practice in which you might chain a bunch of these insights together? I put you in a situation where the environment's constantly shifting in a certain way, so you have to have an insight, and then that insight primes another insight and primes another insight. And so you get what's called the flow experience. The flow experience is a universal experience, truly universal, across genders, language groups, cultural groups, historical background, socioeconomic status, orientation, gender. People are capable of getting into the flow state, and they describe it using almost exactly the same words. And they describe it as one of the most optimal experiences in their life. And people, maybe you've had it. You know, you're in the zone. You're so absorbed in what you're doing, right? And it feels like you're just at one with the world. You're at one with it. And, you know, there's this ongoing sense of discovery. And it's one of the best experiences people can have, and it's not the same thing as pleasure, and it's also often where they're performing at their best. And we do bizarre things in order to get that chaining of insight. We do things like rock climbing, which is like an absurd thing to do. You know, go up that rock, right? It's gonna hurt, it's gonna scratch you, right? It's gonna be exhausting. You might fall and hurt yourself, and once you get to the top, come back down. Why do people do it? They do it because they have to get, right? Think about the kind of insight they have to get. They have to get an insight that isn't just a new thought. If I'm rock climbing, I have to get a procedural, perspectival, sometimes even a participatory insight. I have to have an insight that's not just transforming how I'm looking at this problem, but how I'm holding my body, what skills I'm bringing to bear, you know, my state of mind. And I have that insight, and then I get around the impasse, and I get to a new place in the rock, and then I have to do it again and again, and I get aha, and I get that flow state. And it's amazing, and it's wonderful. And so people do rock climbing because it gets you into the flow state. They do athletics, they do martial arts, they do jazz. All of these things make no sense except for the fact that they add the flow state to you. Now, that transforms you. It transforms you, because the more often you're in the flow state, the more you are transforming yourself comprehensively. Now, of course, that can be hijacked, and that's what video games do. They hijack the flow state. They hijack the flow state. But imagine if you had a way of life in which you were getting a lot more flow. We know that when people flow more, they think their lives are much, much better than when they flow less. Okay, now, what if you had a really comprehensive flow state? It wasn't just a flow state about climbing up the rock or a flow state about playing your trumpet, but what if it was a flow state of just being in the world? Well, that's a mystical experience. That's what a mystical experience is. We've done an experiment on this in my lab, right? And right, a mystical experience is just like being in the flow state, but what you're flowing in is not being a rock climber or being a jazz player. You're flowing at being a person, being a cognitive agent. It's a comprehensive flow. Now, what if that flow state, that's comprehensive one, gave you such a new and profound taste of yourself and taste of the world that you would start changing your relationships, your patterns of behavior, even your sense of self. That's what people do after they have these kinds of mystical experiences. And they radically transform their lives and their sense of self and their character. And it can have a long-lasting significance. So, in fact, I think what I've tried to show you, at least I think, is that there's a continuum. There's a continuum from little transformations, to flow, to mystical, to what are called these full-blown transformative experiences. And so, are you capable of transformation? Yeah, I think it's natural to you. And I think you need transformative experiences to actually develop. Because think about a common metaphor for wisdom, both Eastern and Western, which is as the child is to the adult is to the sage. From a child's perspective, most of what you do doesn't make any sense. It doesn't make any sense because they don't have your perspective and they don't have your character. They don't have your sense of self. So if they were to just stay there, right? If they were just trying to, imagine they were really good at thinking, and some of them are, they're really intelligent. They can't understand what it is to be an adult from within a child's perspective. They have, what we talked about, they have to imitate you, they have to play at being an adult, and eventually they do that self-transcendence. So not only is transformation natural to you on a continuum, you have a rich history of transformation because you've gone from being an adult to being, from being a child to being an adult. And that hasn't stopped, and it doesn't have to stop. So is transformation possible? I've given you, I think, a pretty plausible argument that it's natural to you, and you are only here today because you have gone through such radical kinds of transformation. It's just considered normal, right? And we tend to look for the really extraordinary things that we can make movies about. But you've done it whenever you take a real genuine step forward of maturity, of cultivating a virtue, or when you've had an insight, when you realize, oh wait, that's how I should talk to Peter. That's how I should talk to Peter.
I'm thinking of some like counter examples where, have you seen people just not come up with any insights in their life?
Yeah, of course. So people can avoid, they can bullshit themselves, they can avoid insight, and lots of people are in strategies of avoidance. It's very dangerous. Let me come back to that in a sec. They can reduce their cognitive flexibility. Let's put those together. Let me give you an example. So I've been talking about this transformation as like, I'm opening up the world and I'm opening up myself in this reciprocal manner. I call it reciprocal opening, but it's actually based on work of my friend and colleague, Mark Lewis, who talks about addiction as reciprocal narrowing. So, right, let's talk about the avoidant person. So here I am, complex, difficult things. I'll avoid it, I'll drink some alcohol. And then what the alcohol does is it reduces my cognitive flexibility. I feel better, right? But I haven't actually solved these problems. In fact, I've lost my cognitive flexibility, so my ability to deal with the world goes down. And so the options for my action in the world go down. Mm-hmm. Remember we talked about that internalization? Well, that gets internalized for me. And I start to now lose some of my cognitive flexibility because I lose the sense that I can solve my problems. And then as I lose my cognitive flexibility even more, the world becomes less, until I get to the place where I'm absolutely convinced in the bones of my being that the world can't be any different than it is, and I can't be any different than I am, and I'm locked in because of that reciprocal narrowing, that's addiction. That's addiction. And the addiction crisis is one of the prevalent symptoms of the meaning crisis. Because if you don't give people ways of reciprocally opening in wisdom and in self-transcendence, you make them much, much more liable to reciprocal narrowing and addictive, self-destructive behavior.
It's either like going, expanding, or like a narrowing kind of a spiral.
It's like, yeah, it's like that line in the Shawshank Redemption: either get busy living or get busy dying, right? Because your cognition is such a dynamical system, such a powerfully self-organizing thing, it's either going to do this or it's going to do this.
So my next question is about the wisdom you talked about earlier in our conversation, about how it's different from knowledge, and
Yes.
How it helps us. We need to develop, cultivate wisdom. So yeah, I'm wondering, can you give us a full definition of wisdom, and how can we measure it if we're being wiser?
Last year or the year before, I can't remember. It was published this year, so I think it was last year. My friend and colleague, Igor Grossman, a cognitive psychologist, done a lot of work on wisdom, gathered a bunch of us together, all the people doing research. Well, not all of them, most of the people, prominent people, and we gathered together physically and virtually in Toronto for like 10 hours, and we sort of bashed away at this. All right, and then we all contributed. Igor took lead, and he deserves a lot of the credit, but we all wrote and contributed and discussed, and we have released a consensus paper that was published in Psych Inquiry, a high impact journal. So I think that's very good evidence that we're moving towards a consensus on how we can talk about and measure. We have measures for wisdom. They need to be improved. Everybody knows this, and we're working on improving them. So what you could do, what the work I've done with Leo Ferraro on wisdom is ways of measuring the degree to which people have an effective ecology of practices, and whether or not that's having the requisite cognitive effects. So what you want to do is you want to measure ways in which, so think about it this way, instead of trying to measure wisdom or enlightenment, which are like, whoa, right? Why not measure, are people getting better at overcoming self-deception? Okay. Well, how would you measure that? Well, you might measure if people over time, so you can measure people in two ways. You can measure the same person over time to see if there's a change, or you can compare people who are doing wisdom practices with people who aren't doing wisdom practices to see if there's a reliable difference. And so you can like, let's do one of the things I talked about, active open-mindedness. So active open-mindedness, giving concrete examples is usually really helpful for this. Okay, so what I can do is I can, first of all, before you've undertaken that, or maybe you're not doing it, and I'll measure you in comparison to somebody that is, right? I can measure how much you will jump to conclusions in reasoning tasks. Let me give you like an example, a toy example, right? So I have this pond of water, and there are lily pads on it, and the lily pads are doubling in number every day. And on the 20th day, the lily pads completely cover the pond. On what day did they cover half the pond? And people almost automatically say, well, the 10th day. No, they covered half the pond on the 19th day. Because when you double half the pond, you get the full pond covered. But notice how a part of you wants to jump in and say the 10th day, right? So you can give people a whole bunch of these kinds of problems and see how frequently they jump to conclusions, how biased they are. Now, what's really powerful about this is work done by Keith Stanovich and Evans and a bunch of other people, is how people do on any one of these tests is very predictive of how they do on all the rest. So they're all very strongly predictive of each other, which means we're really measuring something. Okay, so I can measure how much you fall prey to that kind of poor reasoning, self-deceptive reasoning. Is that okay?
Mm-hmm.
Then perhaps I teach you, Jonathan Barron's notion of active active open-mindedness. What does that mean? Well, it means you do the science, first of all, you get the knowledge, you learn about all the different biases. Like, for example, here's a book I have. I have a bunch of these and I go through them. You know, here's a particular bias, the confirmation bias. What does it look like? And what I do is I practice throughout the day trying to find these biases. At the end of the day, almost like a Stoic philosopher, and there's a direct historical connection, I try to note any of the biases that I found. So I try to train myself to note the bias when it's operating, when I'm reasoning, not everywhere, but when I'm reasoning. And then I try to counteract the bias. Now, what they found, and they have good evidence for, is if people take up active open-mindedness, they will reduce the degree to which they leap to conclusions or they get biased in their reasoning. That's a much more powerful predictor of how well people will reason than whether or not they've been taught formal logic, for example, contrary to what a lot of people think. What I would do is I would get a measure of self-deception, like in a particular area, and then come up with an intervention and see the degree to which that intervention ameliorates, reduces that kind of self-deception. I also might see whether or not an intervention enhances people's sense of connectedness to themselves, to each other, and to the world. And if that sense is actually predicting, right, an improvement in their relationships, a reduction in, an improvement in their mental health, etc., etc. So you see, in many ways, I can measure the amelioration of self-deception and the affordance of enhanced meaning in life. And I can see the degree to which those various things are counterbalancing each other, right? For example, I'm getting people do active open-mindedness, but I could also be training them in mindfulness practices and see if that's enhancing the cognitive flexibility that's predictive of insight. I hesitate. I mean, the definition that Leo and I came up with in our particular article is wisdom is rationally self-transcending rationality. Rationality doesn't mean just logic. Rationality means any systematic way of reliably and systemically overcoming self-deception and affording increased meaning in life. So if I have a kind of propositional rationality and a kind of procedural and a kind of perspectival and participatory, and they're all really well stacked and complementing and constraining each other, checks and balances, so that my capacity for overcoming self-deception is constantly evolving and improving itself, I would argue that's wisdom. When we diagnose, like say we're diagnosing somebody whether or not they have borderline personality disorder, how do we do that? Well, we don't have a definition. What we have is a list of like 10 characteristics. And as long as you have 7 of those, you have borderline personality. But that doesn't mean that everybody has the same 7. You could have this 7. I'm not saying you have it, but you could have this 7. Another person could have that, right? Wisdom's like that. I think the meta-perspectival stuff probably is shared by everybody. That's what the consensus is. But there's sort of a set of features. And as long as you have the majority of those features, you're a wiser person.
When you're talking about wisdom, I think a lot of it's the work relates to our mind and how our mind operates. So my question is about how does emotion and our body play in this wisdom game?
Very much, very much. I mean, so when I was in graduate school, I took a course with Ronnie D'Souza called The Rationality of Emotions. And then I was also privileged to, work with Keith Oatley, who talks about how emotions are really central to our rationality. Or you could read the work of Damasio in Descartes' Error. Let's do Damasio because it's a really clear example. So you could do this. You're going to bring in 2 groups of people, right? You're going to bring in people that are statistically normal and sort of the frontal cortex is well connected to more emotional centers of the brain, okay? And then you bring in other people where there's been some damage, some disconnection from the frontal cortex and the more emotional centers. Is that okay? Mm-hmm. And what you're going to do is you're going to give them both a standard IQ test. And they'll both do equally well, right? But this is what you could do. You go and you redo the experiment, but this time you go to the people You go to both groups and you say, do you want to write the test in red ink or blue ink? And the normal people will go, red ink or blue ink. The people that have the emotional disconnect will try to calculate what they want. Like the person trying to calculate the probability of events, and they'll crash. You see, emotions aren't the opposite of rationality. Emotions are like everything else I've been talking about. They are ways of helping you be perspectively intelligent. When I'm in a state of mind called anger, what does it do? It makes certain things salient, and it helps me pay attention, and that's adaptive for helping me to solve problems. Because if I'm in a situation where I'm trying to calculate all of the threats and everything, what should I do? What's the threat? And how should I'm going to hit combinatorial explosion? I'm going to crash. And the thing is, wisdom isn't about getting rid of your anger. Aristotle said this brilliantly. He said, it's not about being angry or not angry. It's about being angry at the right time, to the right degree, for the right reason. That's wisdom. Because we don't think, right, that the wise person is emotionless. In fact, we think the wise person knows how to care better than the foolish person. They care about the right things to the right degree, at the right time, in the right way. That's the wise person. So if you use your intelligence, like if you use it metacognitively, meta-perspectively, to improve how you're using your intelligence, and that means how you're living out and using your emotions, then you're becoming more rational. And that you can be, there's nothing, if you met somebody who was like that, imagine somebody who was always angry in that way, in the wise way, and always loving in the wise way, and always happy in the wise way, and always sad in the wise way. You wouldn't go, what an irrational human being. You'd go, wow, they've picked up on the adaptivity of their emotions and liberated themselves to a significant degree from the way emotions can, like everything else, engender self-deception. But think about it dialogically. You want to sometimes top-down redirect what your body might be leading you to, your body and mind. Let's put them together. Your embodied mind, let's call it that, right? What it might be leading you to find relevant or salient. Sometimes you need to redirect it and intervene. So you need discernment. But you also need to listen for when it's disclosing things to you. For example, one of the things you can do when people are blocked in therapy is get them to pay attention to their gestures. Why are you gesturing this way? And when they pay attention to what their body's doing, they will often get an insight into something that they're not capable of directly initially thinking. So you want to get this balance, always, right? Always this balance between discerning from the top down and disclosing from the bottom up. Dialogue within, there's a dialogue without. And you want those to. So wouldn't it be wonderful if we had communities where the dialogue between us was helping the dialogue within us, and where the dialogue within us was helping the dialogue between us? Wouldn't that be good?
Yes. So right now I have a full picture, or like a more comprehensive understanding of this definition of wisdom. It's more like embodied. It's not just here, but it's more
very
body,
well said.
Emotion.
Yeah, well said. It has to be. In the end, Celine, in the end, in addition to all of your particular goals, you have these two, this was Plato's great insight, you have these two meta drives. No matter what goal I satisfy, I want the satisfying of it to not cause me inner conflict. I don't want to be, right, I want to have peace of mind. And in addition to however I satisfy my goal, I want what satisfies my goal to ultimately be real, not to be an illusion. And so, yeah, you have to get into the depths if people are going to be able to find that connectedness to themselves, peace of mind, and to the world and to other people that they deeply, deeply long for. That's what meaning in life is. Meaning in life isn't sort of a Hallmark card kind of thing. Meaning in life is that these two fundamental meta drives of peace of mind and connectedness to reality are being reliably satisfied for you and for those you love.
While you're saying that, I notice I'm I'm touched. I'm like, oh, it's so heartwarming when you're saying this. I see a lot of love and care you have for yourself and also for whoever is struggling or on this path of meaning searching.
Yeah. Sorry, I sound like I'm self-praising. No, actually being reflective. I take that very seriously, and there's ways in which I make mistakes about that caring. I make mistakes about carrying out the responsibility of that love. But also hopefully people tell me I've also been successful to some degree. What I'm trying to say is I want to acknowledge what you've just shared, and thank you for sharing it, without ever getting into a place where I'm taking it for granted.
Hope you guys enjoyed this video today. And in the next video, John Vervaeke will be sharing his personal breakthrough and personal spiritual awakening journey with us. And if you guys want to learn more about spirituality, personal growth, please subscribe to my YouTube channel. See you guys next Friday. Bye bye.
Fly me to the moon, let me play among the stars, and let me see what spring is like on Jupiter and Mars. Fly me to the moon, let me play among the stars, and let me see what spring is like on